Okay, everyone, welcome back. This is going to get into the start of chapter 12, 12.1, which is the basic structure and function of the nervous system. Um, the nervous system is split up into two parts: the central nervous system, the CNS, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the PNS. It's pretty much everything else. Um, we know that the brain is contained within the cranial cavity of the skull, and that the spinal cord is contained within the vertebral cavity of the vertebral column. And so it might be a bit of an oversimplification to say that the central nervous system is basically what's inside of those two cavities, and the peripheral nervous system is everything that's outside of them. But I think it's actually a pretty good way to start to think about it. It's, in fact, in the name itself, the peripheral nervous system is on the periphery of everything that is centralized, which is the brain and the spinal cord. Um, when we talk about nervous tissue itself, nervous tissue is present in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And nervous tissue contains two basic types of cells. When we talked about that before, those are the neurons and the glial cells. When we talked about glial cells, it's this variety of a type of cell that provides the structural framework of the tissue, and it supports the neurons and their activities. The neuron itself, which we have talked about slightly, it's more of the functionally important of the two. It's basically helps in terms of the communicative structure of the nervous system and the way that the nervous system is able to send signals from one part to the next. Um, so when we look at neurons, we talked about this very briefly, but we can go over it again. There's two different parts of a neuron. The first is the soma, or the cell body, which contains the organelles, and in the central nervous systems, we call the collections of these the nuclei, where in the peripheral nervous system, we'll call them the ganglia, and I'll get to that in a little bit later. And then we have the processes, and there's two types, which are the dendrites, which are the receivers of signals, and the axons, which are the transmitters of signals. And so a neuron will get a signal from its dendrites, send it down the axon, down to the axon terminals, and transmit that signal to the next neuron or to its target. When we talk about the axon, remember we said briefly that it was covered by this myelin sheath, which is just this insulating fatty layer that helps transmit those signals faster. And basically, what I want you to know is that when we talk about those two types of regions, we call them white matter, which is mainly the myelin, and the gray matter, which is the cell body itself and the synapses. So the distinction between gray matter and white matter, we talk about that more when we are talking about the central nervous tissue, because there's going to be large regions that you can actually see with the unaided eye. So when you look at a structure like this brain here, even when we're not looking at it under the microscope, you can see large sections of both white matter and what is called gray matter. And by the way, it's just called gray because it's slightly darker, not because the color itself. The color itself might actually be pinkish because there's blood vessels flowing through it, but just because it's slightly darker. But you can actually see with the naked eye two distinct regions here. And then that's going to bring me into that terminology. Depending on where you find groups of the cell bodies or groups of axons, you will get they will be given different names depending. So a localized collection of neuron cell bodies is when you find them in the central nervous system, that's referred to as nucleus. But if you find that same type of structure, just a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, we call that a ganglion. Okay, and so it's just basically the same type of structure, but it's given different names depending on if it's in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. Similarly, if we talk about bundles of axons, If we find the bundles of axons in the central nervous system, we call that a tract, and the same thing in the peripheral nervous system, we call it a nerve. And so the reason for that is kind of not something I want to get into, but if you need an example, let's say you were on a long road that stretched between two cities. At some point, that road might change names. But from, let's say, you started and you're on Main Street, and then it turns into Broadway. Now, it's the same road itself, it's just in two different areas, so it's given two different names. It kind of works out like that, and that's really all I want to go into it. But what I want you to remember, is what a nerve is versus what a tract is, and what a nucleus is versus a ganglion, okay? And also to be mindful of the fact that we've used the word nucleus in for a lot of different aspects in anatomy and physiology. We talked about protons and neutrons being in the nucleus of an atom. We also talked about the nucleus containing the DNA and cells, and now we're talking about nucleus being a collection of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. And so there's some terminology that you're going to have to remember, and to make sure that you're understanding where the right terminology would be used, okay? Okay, so when we talk about functional divisions of the nervous system, basically you could either, there's two ways that you can consider how the nervous system is divided. First, you could divide it by the basic functions, which are sensation, integration, and response. And secondly, the control of the body could be somatic or autonomic. Basically, and those divisions are going to be largely defined by the structures that are going to be involved in the response. The problem that you'll run into when you try to fit functional differences into anatomical divisions is that sometimes the same structure can be part of several functions. And we'll talk about examples of that in just a bit. But let's get into it. When we talk about the functions of the nervous system, basically, overarching, it's the master controller and communicator of the body, right? We talked about the need for sensation, which is the first major function of the nervous system. It's how you receive information about the environment to gain input about what's happening outside of your body, or sometimes even within your body. The sensory functions of the nervous system will register the presence of a change from homeostasis or a particular event in the environment known as a stimulus. That's stimuli, that's multiple stimuluses. The senses that we most think of are the big five, right? Taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing. The stimuli for taste and smell are both chemical substances, like molecules, compounds, and ions. Touch is physical or mechanical, that will interact with your skin. Sight is a light stimulus, and hearing is a perception of sound waves, which is a physical stimulus, similar to touch. And there are actually more stimuli, more senses than just those, but that list represents the five major senses. Those five senses are all senses that receive stimuli from the outside world, and all of which where you have a conscious perception of them. Additional sensory stimuli might be from the internal environment, like inside of your body, such as the stretch of an organ wall, or the concentration of certain ions in the blood. Your nervous system will sense that, but you will not have a conscious sense of it. The next is response. The nervous system has to produce a response on the basis of the stimuli that is perceived, right? If you touch a hot stove, your nervous system needs to react to that so that you can move your hand away. And that is going from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. So I should have said the sensation of getting that stimulus comes from your peripheral to your central, and then you have to figure out how to respond to it. An obvious response would be the movement of muscles, like I just said, moving your hand from a hot stove. But there's broader uses of the term. The nervous system can cause a contraction of all three types of muscle tissue, like skeletal muscle to move your skeleton, cardiac muscle to influence your heart rate, and smooth muscle as their digestive system moves food along your digestive tract. So responses will include the neural control of glands in the body as well, and like production of sweat by the eccrine and meocrine sweat glands found in the skin to lower your body temperature. And so all of those things are controlled by your nervous system. Responses can be divided into those that are voluntary, remember, like conscious voluntary control of skeletal muscle, and those that are involuntary, like digestion, regulation of cardiac muscle, activation of your sweat glands, etc. Voluntary responses are going to be governed by the somatic nervous system, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and involuntary responses are governed by the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to go over that in the next section. And the last thing is integration. So when stimuli are received by sensory structures and are communicated to the nervous system, they have to process these. That's called integration. Stimuli are compared with or integrated with other stimuli, memories of previous stimuli, or the state of a person at a particular time. This leads to a specific response that will be generated. So if, let's say we're talking about sports, if you see a baseball being pitched to a batter, the batter is not going to automatically swing. He has to notice the trajectory of the ball and its speed, and maybe what count he's in, and then make a decision based on previous experience if he wants to swing. And so that's integration, is just getting immediate context of the stimulus that you received. Okay, so let's talk about three further divisions. The first is the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for the conscious perception and voluntary motor responses. Remember, voluntary means that it's contraction of skeletal muscle, but sometimes skeletal muscle can move without you thinking of it. We call those reflexes. And those, like I said, they happen without a conscious decision to perform them. Like if you were walking around a corner and somebody scared you, you would automatically react by jumping, looking that way. That's a startle response. That's movement of your skeletal muscle, which we know can also be voluntary, but it can also happen without a conscious decision, and that's important. The next is the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for involuntary control of the body, usually for the sake of homeostasis, which again is regulation of the internal environment. You get sensory input from the autonomic functions, can be from sensory structures tuned to external or internal environmental stimuli. The motor output would extend to the smooth and cardiac muscle, as well as glandular tissue. Remember, all things that are not going to be under your conscious control. The role of the autonomic system is to regulate the organ systems of the body, which usually means to control homeostasis. And then the last is something that maybe people usually don't talk about, but it's called the enteric nervous system, which is responsible for controlling the smooth muscle and glandular tissue in your digestive system. It's a large part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's not dependent on the central nervous system at all. Sometimes people will just consider the enteric system just to be part of the autonomic system, because the structures that make up the enteric system are part of the autonomic output that regulates digestion. And so for us, I think we might just do that, but I'll be sure to point out things that fall under the enteric nervous system as well. Okay, so with that, that's going to conclude this lecture. Look forward to the next one coming shortly.